All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Shep Steiner, Associate Professor of Contemporary Art and Theory at the School of Art at the University of Manitoba and editor of the journal Mosaic. I want to welcome you to the lecture series Relative Time, Little Time that the Dutch artist team Dick van der Pol have developed in collaboration with our journal. I'll briefly say that Dick van der Pol have an acutely political perspective on the art field and that their special area of practice involves archival politics, activating situations, and how dialogue and discourse shape the public sphere. We couldn't have organized this conference without them. Before I thank our sponsors and introduce our third speaker, Jonas Staal, I want to acknowledge the traditional land on which the University of Manitoba campuses are located. The original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Thank you to our sponsors, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the University of Manitoba Conference Sponsorship Program, and lastly, the Faculty of Arts, the School of Art, and the Institute for the Humanities, all at the University of Manitoba. As for questions to our speaker, please refrain from interjecting until the end of the lecture and realize you will be recorded. Your consent is appreciated and presumed with participation. In the chat thread, simply indicate to my co-host Sabrina Mark that you have a question, and Carolyn DeCorno, Mosaic's managing editor, can unmute you. If you can ask your questions with cameras on, that is appreciated, but not necessary. Lastly, I remind you that our next set of lectures starts up again in the first week of November with Paul Hubner on time. Now to welcome our invited speaker, Jonas Staal, who goes by the description of visual artist dealing with the relationship between art, propaganda, and democracy. I think this falls well short of the incredible range of projects Staal has been involved in and the complexity of ways his practice transforms art, gives propaganda a positive valence, and radicalizes our notion of democracy by assembling the underrepresented, giving a voice to them, and amplifying these in such a way that we ourselves become loudspeakers for them. His projects potentially make democracy's future polyvocal. Some of his projects include the New World Summit, Collectivize Facebook, climate propagandas, and the Court for Intergenerational Climate Crimes, which he has told us has recently opened last week in Amsterdam with the collaboration of Rada de Souza. His books include No Solar, Brasilia from 2014, Steve Bannon, a propaganda retrospective from 2018, and Propaganda Art in the 21st Century from 2019. The title of Staal's lecture today is Collectivize Time, Redistribute the Future. And given that his politics are performative or propositional, I think he would agree if I suggest that you focus on the content as well as take up a position beside him upstream from that content. Please welcome Jonas Staal.
Thank you so much, Seb, for that very beautiful introduction. Thank you to Mosaic Journal, and to Carolyn and to Sabrina for the organizing work on the back end, to artist Dick van der Pol for inviting me, to all the organizing partners making this gathering possible, and for all of you to come and listen to my talk today. Shep already mentioned the title of my talk, Collectivize Time, Redistribute the Future. And it's a title chosen at a moment shaped by violent forces of global precarization, of rising authoritarianism, ecosystem collapse. And in that context, we face a chronopolitical struggle, a struggle over the politics of time. And this addresses the question who in our current condition or the current reality shaped by racial ecocidal capitalism, who owns time, who controls the means of production of time, access to time, distribution of time, and what is the role of art and cultural work to plant different time seeds, organic and imaginative time machines that contribute to the struggle over the means of production of the present and future. What is the role of art and cultural work in expanding time, in solidarizing, creating solidarity between different time scales, assembling times to collectivize time and redistribute the future? And I want to explore these questions through my artistic practice, through some concrete examples, starting with the chronopolitics, the politics of time of the trillion-dollar company, followed by the chronopolitics of interplanetarism, the chronopolitics of intergenerationality, the chronopolitics of radical pedagogy, and to close with a reflection on the chronopolitics of geology. And for this, I'm going to share my screen with you. There we go. And there we go. So just this week, the Facebook Corporation faced two major setbacks, as I'm sure that many of you have noticed. The first was a connection crisis that made Facebook's platforms, Facebook Messenger, Instagram, and WhatsApp inaccessible for a period of 6 hours. And keep in mind that just Facebook alone, as in the Facebook platform owned by Facebook, has 2.8 billion users. So that was the first setback of this week. The second setback was the testimony at the US Senate hearing by Frances Haugen, a former Facebook product manager of the company's civic misinformation team, who released a wide array of documents that shed further light on the company's active algorithmic pushing of misinformation to maintain social media addiction, sometimes with genocidal consequences as a result. Both events highlight the maddening chronopolitics in the age of trillion-dollar companies. And first of all, in the form of the enormous dependency of these small companies, the enormous dependency of precarious labor on platforms like Facebook for their income, for our income. Facebook being down for 6 hours put the livelihood of millions under threat. Second, it makes additionally clear how our dependency on the platform equals Facebook's own income. Being down for 6 hours of use caused an estimated $79 million in lost revenue for the company. And then we're not yet counting the costs of its plunging stocks. The reality is that all of us registered as users of Facebook are, and its various parent companies, or its various subsidiaries, are Facebook data workers. All of us registered in these platforms are data workers. In 2020, human rights lawyer Jan Verman and I launched the collective action lawsuit Collectivize Facebook. And in our indictment against Facebook, which we will be submitting to the United Nations Human Rights Court in Geneva, we argue that Facebook infringes upon the right to self-determination of peoples and individuals in various ways. We argue that the corporation instrumentalizes users as neo-feudal data workers, as our data constitutes Facebook's profit model. Facebook employs racist algorithms, is used in various surveillance capacities that infringe upon privacy and further impacts democratic elections in disproportionate ways, of which data capture and targeted campaigns of Cambridge Analytica are one of the more well-known examples. And the corporation enables genocidal campaigns, as referenced a moment earlier, in Myanmar, for example, and has willfully advised authoritarian regimes such as that of Duterte in the Philippines. And as a result, human rights lawyer Jan Verman and I, we argue that the very structure of ownership of Facebook is what essentially undermines our individual and collective right to self-determination. And therefore, our demand, the demand of the indictment, is to have Facebook recognized as a public domain. That is the first part of the indictment's demand. And then the second one is to consequently transfer its ownership model to its 2.8 billion active users on the platform today. As unpaid data workers, we worked for it. We worked for Facebook. We were never paid for it. We were never remunerated. And now we must own it. Ownership would be the form of retroactive payment for our labor. It is time to socialize so-called social media. And that also means to collectivize the levers it holds over our time. To clarify, to collectivize Facebook does not mean to reform Facebook or to nationalize Facebook. Our aim is to turn trillion-dollar companies like Facebook, but it would include others as well, into new models of transnational cooperatives, collectively owned and governed by their users. And that is a potential pathway to create transnational unions beyond the corporation and beyond the state. Now, in the past year, Verman and I have organized various pre-trials, what we call pre-trials, preliminary tribunals, leading up to the actual filing of our indictment at the United Nations Council of Human Rights. During these pre-trials, we introduce our indictment. We invite publics to join our case as co-claimants. But we also invite witnesses to witness the future that becomes possible if we win the case. And this act of witnessing the future, as you can see here, three of our witnesses, Hilda Mucharafia, Quincy Gario, and Clara Balaguer, witnessing the future is an essential part of our case, because while our indictment aims to provide a legal framework, a legal pathway to reclaim common ownership over trillion-dollar companies, that still leaves open the question how we would govern these collectively as transnational cooperatives. What would be the decision-making structures for 2.8 billion co-owners of Facebook? Do we ban advertisements? Do we ensure encryption? Do we decentralize servers or even dismantle its infrastructure as a whole, considering its heavy reliance on extractive industries? And for anyone listening that shares our argumentation, we invite you to read the full indictment, join as co-claimant at collectivize.org, where when we file our indictments, we need to be in the thousands, in the tens of thousands, in the hundreds of thousands, to make such a collective case for collectivization. Another recent example of chronopolitical struggle in the domain of the trillion-dollar company was Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos' temporary departure from Earth in his New Shepard rocket ship, which is part of his company Blue Origin, that aims to capitalize on space travel and interplanetary mineral extraction. We could obviously also give a full lecture on the phallic dimensions of this endeavor, but let me focus now on what was for me one of the most telling parts, which was a press conference in which Jeff Bezos thanked the workers and consumers of his trillion-dollar company, of the Amazon company, for making it possible for him to leave Earth's atmosphere. His literal quote when thanking them was, "You paid for all of this." And indeed, they did pay for it, the workers and consumers of the Amazon company, most brutally in the form of heavily precarized, underpaid, non-unionized temp workers in the Amazon gulags that famously piss in bottles and shit in diapers in order to meet their maddening targets. The ruthless destruction of their time is what enables Bezos' time into deep space. The annihilation of workers' presence funds the future time of the spacefaring colonists consisting of the Earth's 0.1% of ruling elites. Now, as an artist, I am part of the global Make Amazon Pay campaign. That is, I think a relevant turnaround from Bezos' quote, "You paid for all of this." Our response would be, "You will pay us back." For the Make Amazon Pay campaign, I developed the visual morphology, which is to say the visual identity of the campaign, but also some of its more visual strategic presences that I will share a few impressions with you in a moment. On Black Friday, November 27, 2020, this campaign that was coordinated by Uni Global Union and Progressive International organized parallel strikes, demonstrations, and projections at Amazon warehouses across the world in India, Bangladesh, Australia, Brazil, Mexico, various European countries in the United States, including projections at CEO Jeff Bezos, his own mansion. The visual morphology of the campaign that I worked on consists of a doubling of the Amazon icon. This is the icon that can be both read as a smile and as a forward arrow. Placed on a red canvas, it emphasizes the demand to return rights to Amazon workers, return their labor by providing fair income, social security, the right to unionize, return the environmental costs of carbon excess, and return profits made through tax avoidance, return our collective time. Simultaneously hijacking and socializing the Amazon visual identity also aims for a first step towards replacement, opening up a visual portal, a collectivist time machine towards a future Amazon that is owned and governed by its workers and users. A collectivized Amazon in length of our campaign Collectivize Facebook. Of course, Bezos' Blue Origin is far from the only attempt to flee the collapse of Earth-based ecosystems and to corporatize outer space. And here I would like to deepen a bit further the chronopolitics, the politics of time, of interplanetarism. One of the most prominent actors in the endeavor to turn humans into an interplanetary species in the coming 10 years or so is, of course, the organization SpaceX, founded by Elon Musk, that aims to terraform Mars as a backup planet in case of environmental or nuclear catastrophe on Earth. Apart from the deep cynicism of sending workers to terraform a backup planet for the 1%, it is important to consider the vocabulary used by organizations like SpaceX, which shamefully replicate colonial language by declaring a new generation of pioneers and the Mars colony, of which you can see here a digital projection of one of the terraforming phases of Mars colonization that was released by SpaceX. My project, Interplanetary Species Society, that you can see here, that I developed together with the Posthumanist Hub in Stockholm, amongst others, takes the form of an alternative experimental biosphere that instead calls for humans to think of ourselves as guests rather than pioneers, and to engage in interplanetary cooperation rather than colonization. And most of all, this Interplanetary Species Society biosphere provokes us to engage our thinking of interplanetarism into a form of intraplanetarism. So a deepening of our role and comradely bonds within ecologies that sustain us on Earth, from interplanetarism to intraplanetarism. Now, this particular project was located in the Reaktorhallen, which was a former underground nuclear facility in Stockholm. And it seemed relevant to me that building the facility underground, the nuclear facility at the time, was once intended to protect the surface from radiation, from nuclear radiation. While in the course of the unfolding climate collapse in which we find ourselves now, it is us who will be forced underground, deeper within Earth, intraplanetary, to protect ourselves from the radiation of the surface. So there's a fundamental détournement taking place in terms of surface-subsurface relation. Our alternative biosphere gathered humans with neo-constructivist ammonites that you can see here, proletarian plants, and meteorites to enable a form of assembly not only with the ecologies of our present, but also with those of the deep past. The neo-constructivist ammonites, for example, are fossils of ammonites, a family of octopus and squid that lived between 300 and 66 million years ago and that perished in the fifth mass extinction. Now, it might seem that human life and ammonite life is vastly different in terms of its lived time, its organic composition, but the ammonites are witnesses of the fifth mass extinction, just as we are witnessing the sixth. They are fossils, and we are fossils in the making. Further, the ammonite is literally the fossil in fossil fuels, millions of years of aggregated, decomposed bodies of animals and plants that racial ecocidal capitalism burns to accelerate the present and undo the possibility of a future in which humans and non-humans can survive in a meaningful way. The constructivist bodies and slogans of the ammonites, of course, refer to the work of the constructivist and productivist artists in the Russian Revolution. And that might seem paradoxical, as these artists embraced the industrialist paradigm. But artists such as Popova, Stepanova, Rodchenko, they also developed a theory of the object as comrade. The object as comrade. The idea that in revolution, commodities would not just become collective property, but revolutionary agents in their own right. And in interplanetary species society, this idea is expanded into the political recognition of the non-human comrade, with whom we share an ecology from deep past to the present and an urgent struggle to enable deep futures. The proletarian plants in the interplanetary species society, of which you can see an image here, consist of historical images of from socialist posters, in which it is not the heroic human workers, but plants themselves that have become the main proletarian agents. And of course, such a recognition of non-human workers, of non-human comrades, has little to do with the reality of mass agricultural and industrialist embrace of the history of real existing socialism. But it's interesting that these poster images are nonetheless planted as a kind of time seeds, term I used also in the introduction to this talk. Time seeds, a kind of imaginative time machine that call on the awareness that the egalitarian socialist paradigm must in the end apply to all ecosystem workers, human and non-human alike, meaning that in a way, the poster represents a tension between the existence of real existing socialism and all of its obvious limitations, and the fact that in its imaginary, that the socialist imaginary in many ways was already pushing towards a different time, a time in which it would become inevitable to recognize all ecosystem workers, human, plant, as comrades, as proletarians in the struggle. Simultaneously, in the center of the biosphere, I'll jump one image further, in the hole where the nuclear reactor used to be, an assembly of 3 meteorites was present. 3 meteorites dated up until 4.5 billion years ago, meaning that the meteorites that gathered in the place where the reactor was used to be housed predate the existence of Earth as such. The surface on which they are assembled, Earth's surface, did not exist at the time that the meteorites themselves came into being. And so from the hole from the hole where our nuclear-driven future used to be, a future that makes the future itself impossible, one encountered a gaze of deep past, a gaze that predated Earth, staring back at us, a call for cosmic assembly, stretching and expanding time. Now, of course, the extraction of labor time by trillion-dollar companies can, of course, not be disconnected from the material extraction that precarizes time for all human and non-human workers in our violated ecosystems. This chronopolitics of intergenerationality is something that I address in the work Court for Intergenerational Climate Crimes, that was already mentioned before, a more than human tribunal that prosecutes climate criminals, we could also say time criminals, in the form of transnational corporations and states, a project that I developed together with writer, academic, lawyer, and activist Rada de Souza. The Court for Intergenerational Climate Crimes that you see in action here, in use here, confronts, in short, the CICC. It will save me some time by not having to say Court for Intergenerational Climate Crimes every time. The CICC confronts a fundamental absence in existing legal institutions. And that absence is formed by the category of the future. There is no category of the future in existing legal institutions. Courts can prosecute the present based on evidence of the past, but they cannot prosecute the present for the violence done upon unborn humans, plants, and animals of the future. As such, transnational corporations like Unilever, ING, or Airbus, with the complicity of states, they can store their ecocidal crimes in the future. They can store their crimes in time. And these are actually also the transnational companies that we will be prosecuting in the form of public hearings at the end of October. Unilever, ING, Airbus, and the Dutch state, all transnational companies registered in the Netherlands, although most of the witnesses that will participate in the public hearings of the Court for Intergenerational Climate Crimes are not from the Netherlands. This, of course, shows the somewhere else here that that is the reality of the functioning of many transnational corporations, registered in one place where they can extract and maintain some kind of air of legitimacy or respectability, while engaging in brutal forms of extraction, if not war crimes, in other parts of the world. The Intergenerational Climate Crimes Act that was drafted by Rada de Souza, my collaborator, forms the legal foundation of the CICC. And it calls for a redefinition of time in the context of the struggle for climate justice. Past, present, and future are interdependent and radically equal. Ancestors of the future, unborn successors, must be recognized as fundamentally equal and simultaneously present in the public hearings that we hold against transnational corporations and the states that enable them. The form of the court itself consists of evidence of intergenerational climate crimes. It is populated by extinct animals, plants, as well as ammonite fossils. At the center of the court, a large ammonite fossil is placed in a hexagonal shape of refined oil, literally the fossil in fossil fuels that I also referenced earlier. And they shape a maddening, in the center of the court, they shape a maddening chronopolitical arena in which the clash between millions of years of inherited Earth memories and the burning present manifests. An arena that equally challenges us to demand not just 2 or 3 generations more, as the political class tends to do, the children of my children. This is as far as political imaginary of time or the concept of the future seems to go. This would be an arena, this arena of that's shaped by the ammonite, is one that provokes us, that demands us to demand 1 million more years of living comradely worlds. Surrounding the center of the court, signs are raised depicting extinct animals placed on a radiant yellow background, each termed comrade in a different, sometimes near extinct language, emphasizing that there's, of course, a direct relationship between the extinction of animals and plants and the extinction of cultures, traditions, collective memories that are inherently tied to the destruction of these ecosystems. In between these extinct animals, depictions of these extinct animals, woven banners of extinct plants are present, each equally termed comrade. And upon closer look, one might see how the outer forms of the plants are maintained through small tapes and wires, traces of the attempts by scientists to maintain the ghostly shape of these massacred ecosystem workers. Violent reminders that the perverse notion of colonial discovery is inherently tied to erasure. For the colonial deaf form, in opposite to life form, for the colonial deaf form cares not to know, it only cares to own, and ownership and the so-called right to ownership that the CICC fundamentally rejects equals deaf. Ownership equals deaf. Honoring non-human ecosystem workers as comrades is a key political recognition central to the CICC that emphasizes interdependent struggle against the reductive regime of rights that dominates our present legal institutions. If one harms Comrade River, one harms all comrades, animals, plants, humans, that live in interdependency with that river. How can rights, in that sense, in that real interdependent and intergenerational sense, how can rights ever be individual? How can rights ever be only human or only animals? When the reality of our struggle as ecosystem workers is one in which our collective self-determination so fundamentally relies on one another. We are comrades across the human and non-human world because we are part of an existential struggle, a struggle between our defense of living worlds, past, present, and future, against the racial, ecocidal, capitalist deaf form. Now, you might have noticed in the talk so far that much of my work takes an organizational form, which is a practice that I term organizational art. Artworks that take the form of alternative emancipatory institutions, often speculative institutions, whether these be alternative tribunals, transnational campaigns, or experimental biospheres. They are attempts to pre-enact, to institute alternative futurities through spatial and performative morphologies, attempts to reorganize our collective relationship to and our shared ownership of time. And working in this field of organizational art is simultaneously a response to the overwhelming infrastructures available to trillion-dollar companies and the states that enable them. They control and monopolize our lived time, and our time is their capital. That manifests, that scale manifests not only through massive data centers, transportation networks, paralegal assaults on our juridical institutions, tax havens, but also in the form of endless think tanks and elite schools that aim to maintain across generations the vested interests in the racial ecocidal capitalist paradigm. Those of us who dedicate their life and work to emancipatory politics, we need infrastructures of our own. And this is where the chronopolitics of radical pedagogy comes into play. When I founded the Training for the Future camp, of which you can see some of the training facilities here, when I founded the Training for the Future camp with Florian Malzacher in 2018, we felt it was essential to expand emancipatory infrastructures to train and practice alternate futurities, to reclaim the means of production of the future, as we phrased it at the time. Our faculty of trainers in the training camp consists of art activists, protest choreographers, autonomist organizers, zoopologists, progressive hackers, data communalists, futurological historiographers, social interrogators, anal armies, care collectivists, emancipatory mimologists, pan-socialist agitators, and many others. And while the trainer-trainee divide in the form of the training camp might suggest a disciplinary relationship, our trainers equally participate in others' trainings as trainees, and effective trainings turn trainees into trainers. Meaning, in this complicated sentence, that naming a division of power in the training is meant to overcome that very division. A successful trainer turns trainees into trainers, redistribute knowledge, tools, and practices to other expands that reach and changes the temporary hierarchy that is named through the trainer-trainee divide. But what does it mean to train the future? And I will share some images while I'm talking of some of the different trainers that have taken place in the camp. What does it mean to train for the future? For us, for Florian Malzacher and myself, it means to fundamentally dismantle the dystopian normativity underlying our present-day culture, resulting from the intersecting crisis of rising authoritarianism, economic precarity, and environmental catastrophe that have diminished the idea of a future to nothing but a worsening of the present. But training for the future also means to acknowledge the differences in our pasts and presents. We train, in that sense, for futures in the plural. But we also seek to solidarize, to create connection, solidarity between these various futurities in the process of reclaiming a many world for all, a world of many worlds, as the Zapatista Army of National Liberation declared it. The localities where our training camps are held, they matter. In 2018 and 2019, they took place amidst the industrial remnants of the Ruhr area in Germany. Archaeologies of a future driven by a belief in industrial progress. This location embodies a history of proletarian consciousness and unionization, a history where humans, workers, recognize their agency in shaping future history, but it equally forms a history of predatory class oppression and of an extractivist industrial paradigm that denied agency to non-human comrades and has burned livable futures for all of us. The two training camps that we organized in these ruins of the future took the form of neo-constructivist landscapes where hybrid training objects propagated fragmented slogans of the past as part of a collective exercise to train the future. As such, the location and the form of our camps together enact a critical, dialogical, and morphological solidarity. And with morphological solidarity, I mean that it references aspects of past labor struggles, for example, and emancipatory inheritances that cannot be completely disconnected from the industrial paradigm without replicating them and without glorifying the extractivist mindset that brought them about in the first place. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the locality of the 2021 training camp took a decentralized form, highlighting the way in which the pandemic further intensified dystopian normativity. Additionally, vaccine apartheid has made the vast disparities in wealth and livability even more visible, exacerbating the unequal pasts, the unequal presents, the unequal futures that we carry with us. This pandemic period showed staggering quarterly figures for trillion-dollar companies like Amazon, providing proof for all to see that our common crisis is the capital accumulation of the 0.1% that make up the ruling elite. The age of climate-fueled pandemics, its beginning marked by COVID-19, shows us the endgame of disaster capitalism, in which remnants of the future will remain the sole property of tech elites hiding in underground luxury bunkers in New Zealand or self-exiled to the terraformed backup planet Mars. Yet in the face of disaster, questions of redistribution and collectivity gain additional urgency. And that's why under the title Collectives, Collectivity and Collectivizations, we organized parallel trainings in Argentina, Colombia, the United States, the Philippines, South Africa, Rojava, which is the western part of Kurdistan, Italy, and Switzerland. And I showed you already a few images of these parallel trainings that were happening across the world for the 2021 Training for the Future camp. By developing a decentralized version of our training camp, we attempted to contribute to the reclaiming of futures as a common, and to do so at exactly the moment when the commons are being stolen from us in the most violent manner. The COVID-19 pandemic demanded each trainer to revisit the conditions within which collectivity was to be shaped in a moment of deep atomization and isolation. And as such, each training proposed a methodology to refine what it means to assemble and to do collective work when the systems we inhabit and the catastrophes they produce fragment us so profoundly. The result of this decentralized training camp was a collective choreography happening across different geographies at the same time, but with different pasts, different presents, and different futures. As I'm slowly arriving to the last part of my talk, I think it's important to acknowledge that for those on the side of emancipatory politics, time always seems to be against us. The trillion-dollar company owns our time. Our precarious lives undermine time to organize and to build lasting counterpower infrastructures of our own. Extractivism burns the time we used to call a future. But even the past, in many ways, seems to be poised against us. The origin of life, we are told, is based on predation, is based on predatory competition. This is the dominant myth. The origin of life is based on predatory competition. So why are we so naive to think that it could be any different? And in this logic, in this dominant narrative, racial ecocidal capitalism is essentially naturalized. It is not just that capitalism is presented to us as the lesser of evils, but even more so as an expression simply of life, of what life is, as that what we, for good or for bad, simply are. And what is important to recognize here is that the chronopolitical struggle that I try to highlight some aspects through my practice, is that the chronopolitical struggle does not just concern our future, our present and recent past, but the narratives of deep past as well. Narratives that define our concept of what life is or what it could be. And here I want to address, as the last part of my talk, the chronopolitics, the politics of time of geology. For about a century, geologists claimed that the carnivorous Cambrian explosion that occurred 541 million years ago was the evolutionary leap that resulted in complex life on Earth. So this kind of evolutionary rat race is what is inherent to the kind of boom of complex life on Earth. This was the story of the Cambrian explosion. But geologists at the time ignored facts that contradicted this view, which might have something to do with their inability to imagine that complex life could result from anything other than capitalist predation, than a kind of pre-capitalist capitalism. However, in the geological era immediately preceding the predatory Cambrian period, known as the Ediacaran period, also as the Lippian period, complex life forms coexisted in a collectivist, non-predatory oceanic world. The Ediacaran lasted from 635 to 541 million years ago. That's 94 million years. The multicellular Ediacaran life forms had no shells. You can see some examples in paleo art, not my own, that depicts, based on fossil remnants, what more or less this oceanic world could have looked like. So these multicellular Ediacaran life forms had no shells. because they did not have any reason to protect themselves from one another. And this is why their fossil record is enormously sparse. It's very, very rare that we find Ediacaran fossils, because their soft bodies could only be captured through a kind of sudden death mask. So when there will be a sudden movement, an earth movement, or kind of like a layer of sand coming down on them, this might capture at that moment their resemblance. But Earth really is much more equipped to fossilize the history of predation than that of non-predatory life forms, because histories of predation produce shells and spikes, and they leave an enormous amount of hard body components that can be memorized. So this could be an interesting critique on Earth memory itself in the fossil record, that it has a revisionist tendency to only recognize and memorize histories of predation and war, you could say, rather than collectivist forms of life. So this has resulted in a misrepresentation of Earth's own memory that benefits the racial capitalism's origin of life story. The Ediacaran morphologies resembled discs, worm-like shapes, and elegant plant-like forms, characterized by a quilted body architecture. Progressive geologists maintain that the Ediacarans can be classified as neither plants nor animals, their existence defying biological or gendered classification. The Ediacaran fossils give testimony to a vast time frame of complex life forms coexisting in a cooperative, collectivist ecology without any traces of predatory relationships between them. An interdependent ecology shaped through photosymbiosis, chemosymbiosis, and osmotrophy declared the Cambrians' arms race of shells, spikes, and teeth that would come afterwards useless. The beginning of complex multicellular life was the result of other than human collectivist work. And that means that today we can proudly declare that our egalitarian desires, the egalitarian desires expressed through emancipatory political struggle, represent Earth heritage, an other than life origin of 94 million years of collectivism. The Ediacaran is named after the Ediacaran Hills in South Australia. That is the home of the Adnyamathanha people, which evokes the Aboriginal concept and practice of the dreaming with capital D, where ancestors and descendants coexist. Do Ediacaran biota share a dreaming with Karl Marx? Do they share the same dream, or do they dream one another? Or do they dream one another or of one another beyond time and across space, as Rangea, Karl Marx, Swartkuntia, and Ernietta do in this paleo artwork? Did the Ediacaran dream with Alexandra Kollontai as her horizon of a new revolutionary sexuality, an expanded collective family, a symbiotic sensuality, a redistribution of love, mirrors the non-gendered, neither plant nor animal life forms of the Ediacaran? Did the Ediacaran dream with Ho Chi Minh, a classless paradigm of interdependence, specific to place, but interconnected through pan-oceanic currents of nutrients in solidary circulation? Did the Ediacaran dream with Thomas Sankara, a communalization of ecology of more than human proletarians, enabling new symbiotic collectives of earth workers? This is not the dream as a phantasm, or the dream of sleep that processes the fragments of one's past and day-to-day life and desires. The dreaming with capital D is a chronopolitical revolt that links material struggles for egalitarian life forms across space and time. Marx did not dream up the Ediacaran, nor did the Ediacaran dream up Marx. In the dreaming, their struggles converge intimately, comradely, materially. Against capitalism's origin of life mythology, this collectivist dreaming affirms the material reality of egalitarian life forms made possible through the dedicated struggle of non-human and human ecosystem workers. The study of the Ediacaran belongs to the field of prolet geology, Earth memory studies of other than human proletarian and collectivist life forms. The paleo artworks that I have been showing to you so far are part of the department of prolet geology that I'm currently developing with counsel by prolet geologist Vincent V. van Gerven-Oei. A collectivist geology is a geology not merely of rock and solid earth, but a geology of shared ecosystem work, of possibility and collective imaginary. A collectivist dreaming that ties other than human work to the present and our struggles for deep futures for all. A dreaming of a different time that was and that will be. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me.
Thank you, Jonas. Fantastic talk. Jonas has agreed to ask some or answer some questions from the audience. So if there are some questions for Jonas, he's willing to answer those. And remember, just send your request to Sabrina and we can unmute you.
Lena Brown actually has the first question.
Great.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, perfectly.
Thank you so much for that talk. That was very, very hopeful and really well done. I'm so glad I was able to hear that. Near the beginning, you had some appropriation of logos and branding, like the Amazon arrow and different fonts to bring into your own work, to criticize and to gain, for your collective projects. And I was wondering if you have run into any problems or legal issues with appropriating branding or logos with your work, or if that has been a problem at all.
Not with this particular work, I have to say that there was a pre-trial, thanks for your question, by the way, sorry. There was a preliminary tribunal that we organized as part of an international computer data conference in which Facebook was attempting to join, because I think one of their parent companies was sponsor of the conference, and they were trying to get into the program in the sense to have a space to speak in response to our allegation, to our collective action lawsuit that we were presenting. But we managed to, well, we don't accept that, because by the time that we file at the UN Council of Human Rights, of course, companies like Facebook will have armies of lawyers that will create more than enough time and space for them to run their lobbyistic narratives. So there's no reason why we would facilitate that in the process of still building the kind of critical mass to support this, to join the lawsuit, to make it a real collective action lawsuit. I have had several situations in which appropriating these kind of logos or visual identities become an issue, and generally the strategy that I laid out with my lawyer is, one is the right to citation, that there's just as an academic has a right to reference an X amount of a given paper, an artist has a right to reference in a kind of collage type form. So if you look at the entirety of our pre-trial setups, you see not just one logo, you see many logos. You could very well argue this is a spatial collage that references, that quotes, just like a paper, academic paper quotes a piece of text, quotes in an image, and it is not actually their logo because the colors have changed, they're socialized in our context. So on two different levels, that is an argumentation. There's another legal argumentation that can be used, and this has to do with the level of impact in which that public companies may have on public consciousness, where referencing it or reproducing an image can be argued to belong on the kind of like freedom of speech type of space of expression, so to say. So it is something that I've had to it's a good question because it's definitely something I've had to anticipate on before. Another good strategy is to just never have enough money, because then there's only so much that they can do against you.
Is there another question? Sabrina, thank you, Lena and Jonas.
Not at the moment.
Can I ask you, Jonas, about, you use the term pretrial in relation to the, both the Collectivize Facebook, I think, and maybe the Court for Intergenerational Climate Crime. But what also occurred to me was the proximity to the notion of a show trial. And I wonder, with its kind of propagandistic kind of purposes, could you speak about the differences between that, or if that was a conscious choice not to obviously refer to that reference or not?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in the case of Collectivize Facebook, the public events we organize in which we try to convince and have publics join as co-claimants in our lawsuit, we call pre-trials, because they are preliminary tribunals, preparatory tribunals, before we actually file our indictment against Facebook at the UN Human Rights Council. So that is a project that relates directly to an existing legal institution. Then it's a show trial insofar as that you would say that the UN Human Rights Council is a show tribunal. In the case of the Court for Intergenerational Climate Crimes, of course, we don't rely on an existing legal institution. We organize our own public hearings. They're procedurally led by Rada de Souza. She's the one who drafted the Intergenerational Climate Crimes Act, which is the juridical foundation of the CICC. And we gather public prosecutors, witnesses, CEOs of the companies that are accused of climate crimes do receive a summons, and they receive the accusation that is articulated against them at forehand. So in that sense, we certainly follow a procedural. We propose a procedural framework, an alternative legal framework, but it's true that we do not have the same executive power as an existing court has. So that then very quickly can lead to the accusation. Is it a show trial? Is it just a way of harming or creating maximum discomfort for the companies that we are accusing? I think someone like Rada, my collaborator, would say, well, the real show trial is, of course, the idea that the law can facilitate justice, or that the history of the law has anything to do with achieving collective justice. I think she would argue, as she has done in her book, What's Wrong with Rights, that the concept of rights themselves are inherently tied to propertization, the propertization of the world. That our legal system, the reason why it came into being was not to seek for justice, but for the legalization of theft and the protection of private property, which is not to say that in legal history there's not been a lot of developments through, for example, the concept of the right to self-determination, which really provides an alternative framework to that dominant proprietary logic. But this is the logic. This is the inheritance of the law and of the concept of rights. So that has led to situations in which even corporations have rights. Corporations are people too. Corporations have a right to free speech. How is that not a show trial? How is it not a show trial to suggest that there's any equality between trillion-dollar companies that boast a yearly income that far outgrows any average state? How is the suggestion that such a legal framework that is entirely made to facilitate private corporations and private property, and that is leading to an increasingly unlivable world for the majority of us, how is that not a show tribunal? So I would say that our attempt is to fundamentally reverse by providing an alternative juridical framework that tries to make visible the show trial that is the ongoing so-called international human rights framework under which this increasingly unlivable world is being legalized, legitimized.
Could I just follow up with that? Is there, how much of a reach was it to begin working with lawyers in your art practice? I'm just interested in that transition toward this collaborative work with lawyers and.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think it came through another organizational artwork that I didn't discuss today, but that you, Shep, mentioned in the introduction, which is the New World Summit, which was a series of alternative parliaments that I created, in which I invited stateless and blacklisted organizations that were prosecuted in the ongoing war on terror as so-called terrorist organizations, and which actually tried to make our gatherings try to make visible the systemic state terror that is part of the so-called war on terror. And in that process, I met a lot of lawyers that were supporting progressive organizations that were being criminalized in the process of the war on terror, and it kind of brought a multi-year dialogue with several of these progressive lawyers. And I think that there is also in my work. My work tends to have a very spatial and performative dimension. And I think for many of the lawyers I was working with, it was a very recognizable environment for them because of course, their work. I mean, Rada always used to say when she would speak of the court, she would say, I have to be at the theater. Like I'm at work, I'm at the theater. Because, I mean, she understands that the performativity of law, the construction of justice, its rhetorical shapes and forms, it is a performative spectacle of some sort. It's the same for parliamentary processes. Like, what is a theater other than what is a parliament other than a theater? And in European genealogy, of course, the theater and the public theater and the public space of political assembly have everything. And they have a shared history. So I think that there was a kind of understanding. I've seen a kind of understanding between me and them and the lawyers that even though we come from different fields, we bring in different competences and specializations. I think we recognize that the construction of reality is performative, whether that's a legal reality or political reality or cultural reality. We stage reality, and I don't mean stage with it being fake. Because what happens in the court or what happens in the parliament very much constitutes reality for the many. So it's performative, but it's real performance. It's expanded. It's an expanded understanding of performance.
Thank you, Sabrina.
Hi, Dick Vanderpool has a question next, and then followed by Melanie.
Moet ik het hele video laten zien of niet? Nee. Hi, Jonas. Thank you so much for this great talk and also for the very humorous end, I think, with the drawings of Marx and, you know, melted or in symbiosis with these other creatures. Really very nice. There's a not so full-born question that is sort of perhaps linking issues of democracy to ownership. I'm sort of thinking, okay, there's from the issue of the training for the future, the trainings for the future. Many gatherings are organized and many data are produced. One of the questions would be where to are these data? What is their goal? Who owns these data? And where are these data going? Are they going to a next training for the future? Are they going to be collected to become something like a manifesto, or I don't know? And then the other thing that we were thinking is how, you know, to speculate or had the training for the future, I also understand as a training for other forms or potential new forms of democracy. Perhaps, what would that be like? And if we think along the lines of that data are being owned by the ones who collect them, and votes are being owned by the ones who collect them, then how are these issues of democracy and data for the future being connected? Not a full-grown question, no? And somehow I think also there's something with these dreams that I'm thinking that perhaps the dreams do escape this ownership issue. I don't know, very speculative, loose question. Anyway, I hope, yeah, help me.
It's great. Thank you, Elizabeth, also for sharing your thoughts. I'm also very happy that I was able to surprise you with my paleo art. It's meant very seriously, of course.
Yeah.
But but I can see the joy of this. There's a joy in seeing this kind of hybrid forms linking with one another, the body forms. And the first question relates to the training for the data that emerges from Training for the Future training camp. If I understood it correctly, we have over the last 3 years, we've been working with a shifting faculty, but always with returning trainers from one camp to another. So there is a lot of kind of like training competences and tools that are being presented in being shared in one training camp. They also merge and move over to another. So it's not as if these chapters are entirely separated. And we are presenting this year or publishing a Training for the Future handbook, which is a 350-page book that kind of collects all the manuals of the different trainings. So the different manuals and methodologies that have been used in the training camps so far, which is also a way of kind of potentially expanding the reach, especially after the training camps that we held this year, because no one could travel to a training that took place in parallel unless you were there in that particular community. Although I have to say that was a kind of emergency response to how to avoid being in this position in the period of the pandemic, just waiting for it to end, because it's not going to end. It's the first symptom of perpetual disaster that we're in. So these are the conditions of our struggle. Like, we can wait, but we will be waiting for Godot. So how to engage that reality, and this hyper locality that came as a result in trainings in Sicily. There were trainers that only trained with one trainee because that was what was allowed under the conditions of the pandemic, whereas in Bogota it was a completely different story. I think the hyper locality that came as a result, that wasn't intended, but came as a response to the pandemic, might actually hold a lot of solutions for how to continue this work. But the concrete answer to your question is the data of the training camp is the embodied data that comes from participating in the trainings, between trainers that shift from one camp, join from one camp to another, of trainees that become trainers, gain competences that they can share in their own respective contexts. I think the training camps continue in many ways that are not organized by us, but it is a continuous sharing of knowledge. And through concrete tools like a handbook, which will of course be an open source book and be downloaded for free. Then you said, you asked the question, like, what is this data? Is it about producing new forms of democracy or radicalizing democracy, as Sepp was saying earlier in the introduction? I think yes, although we don't make that, we try to assemble in the Training for the Future camp really a kind of radical plurality of futures that can sometimes also heavily conflict in what kind of futures they propose to be training for. But what I think is interesting is that all of them are democratic insofar as that they provide tools that can enforce the right to self-determination beyond the kind of democratic rights that are enabled by states. So, for example, Women on Waves has been a returning trainer. a collective, an organization that trains in how to provide safe and safe abortions, how to develop strategies to provide the right to abortion in contexts in which it is in countries where it is forbidden. They also gave trainings at the training camp on how to falsify medical prescriptions, so you can get the medicines needed even in contexts where you're not allowed to. I think that's a really concrete tool that is fundamentally democratic, because it fundamentally supports the right to self-determination when it comes to bodily reproduction and bodily sovereignty or bodily autonomy. So in that sense, I would say, yes, they are democratic, but it's the paradox. Sometimes democracy means the democratic act is to kick down the door of a university and to occupy it in resistance against the neoliberalization of education. Then the university will say that's not democratic because you disrupted our right to our private property. The truth is that reclaiming those spaces that should be collective spaces is a democratic act. So sometimes the democratic act is not the same as what the law prescribes to be democratic. And I think the training camp, the utopian training camp that we run, pushes a plurality of tools that challenge the kind of limits of what democratic action could or should be. And the last point that you made that I thought was really interesting is, does dreaming escape ownership? And I was thinking, of course, in what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, we're dealing now with a lot of predictive markets. So because your health app knows when you ran and how much you ran and how hungry you are, and because it's linked to your smart car, and the smart car drives by the stores that it knows based on your usage, what food you want, what allergies you have. There's a predictive market. We're living it's no longer just about trying to sell you a product that you might or not want. It's really about mapping out on a micro data level, on a psychographic level, what you are going to want. It is about trying to dream you before you are able to dream your desires yourself. That is the kind of predictive market of surveillance capitalism that we're in. And indeed, the dreaming with capital D that I referenced in relationship to Aboriginal trajectories, the dreaming that represents the solidarization of egalitarian desires and imaginaries across space and time, that is one that fundamentally escapes ownership, because it reaches back to a reality of a world in common, that is not a world that is predicted to us, but that is shaped collectively by us. So I think it's a very while our dreams are being increasingly commodified, I would agree with you that the dreaming, not as an imaginative space, but the dreaming as the ties between different struggles across different times, is definitely the base through which to escape ownership.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
This was a kind of like mutual live thinking from you from you and back at you. So
Unresolved, yeah. But no, it's great. It's great. Thank you. Thank you. And I didn't mean to say that I found the images just humorous, no, the drawings. I would like to study them more closely also. So
we will organize a paleo art afternoon together
around those. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Jonas, for this fascinating talk. And it's also just really challenging and inspiring. So thank you for sharing that with us. I thought of a couple of questions. My first one is short. And I'm just interested in what I see as a commitment to collaboration in your work. And I wonder whether you might talk a little bit about collaboration as commitment, as method, etc. And then the other thing that I started to wonder about in terms of thinking about fossils as comrades, and maybe linking that with something you said about being a guest rather than a colonizer or a pioneer, right? So in some of the indigenous thought from closer to us here, there's been some discussion by Zoe Todd, who's a Métis anthropologist, about fossils as kin. also from Max Leboiron, who's also Métis and a scientist, about thinking about plastics as land, or thinking about the demand for relationality, responsibility, and obligation in connection with fossils. So I just wonder if you might have some thoughts about how those things are connected or related. Thanks.
Thanks, Melanie, for these questions. Commitment to collaboration was the first question that you were asking. Yeah, I mean, that's somehow a very obvious question and an important one, and also difficult to answer. But yes, for me, it's essential because why? Because it allows me to always think of my work relationally. So to work with transnational organizations, pan-European movements. I'm currently working actively with Progressive International, Democracy in Europe Movement 2025, but also with different unions, progressive political parties, social movements, progressive lawyer networks. This is for me essential because it's impossible for me to think of my work as it's also so assembly and organizationally based and linked. I can't think of it isolated from these relationships, and I want my work to contribute, however minor that is, to deepening and strengthening those relationships. It's the same as that I don't necessarily see politics and art as exactly the same thing, but I can't see how they are not shaping each other's conditions of being. So, I mean, someone can obviously be a politician and an artist, so it's not as if you cannot be those two things at the same time. I would rather say the fields represent different competences. An organizer represents different competences than the kind of morphological competences of visual literacy of an artist, designer, or architect. But if we want a progressive or emancipatory art, an art that believes in public ownership, in the creation of public space, public domain, public access, the collective right of expression and narration of our histories and symbols and stories, then we need an emancipatory politics. Like, it goes hand in hand. In any country now, in the context of Europe, we've seen various states moving to extreme forms of authoritarianism and fascism. And the first thing that happens is that critical journalism, critical research, critical art is immediately being repressed. Directorships in museums and public institutions and universities are changed, and new nationalist mythologies and nationalist artists and academics and researchers are being put into place. I can't see in that context how we could ever separate art and politics if we don't do the work to make sure that we enforce emancipatory hegemony. Then we will not have emancipatory forms of art, culture, research. So they have to go hand in hand for me, even though it doesn't mean that the competences that are part of the field of politics and art are necessarily the same. But I always see them relationally. And yeah, I guess that would be my first response to your question. Then you asked or shared some very interesting notes on building on my comments on the fossils as comrades and humans as interplanetary guests in order to kind of undermine or dismantle the colonial and imperialist legacies that we are about to, or that transnational corporations are about to reproduce in the process of becoming an interplanetary spacefaring species. And you mentioned soy toads and the idea of fossils as skin and plastics as land. And I think that's really powerful, especially the sentence plastics as land, because it's also about recognizing that that the ecology in which we are ecosystem workers today is a violated ecology. It now also exists of plastic typhoons and toxic tornadoes. Like, they are part now of the ecosystem that we inhabit. And when you're talking of plastics, we are talking about those very same fossils, this very same inherited earth memory that is that is now tragically manifest in a plastic cup, or or something else. And I think an important aspect of that, I was working with a collective of global toxic waste researchers called Toxic Commons. And one of the things that we were propagating for, that I was working on with them, was the notion of insourcing rather than outsourcing. That to legally obligate communities to live with their own waste, so to insource rather than outsource, meaning to legally dismantle the toxic waste trade, would inevitably lead to a lessening of the production of these very same toxins. If we have to relate to them in a comradely way, if we have to coexist with our own toxins, we produce less toxins. It is only because of a brutal cultivated inequality that the global toxic waste trade can exist the way it does. So I think it's very Zoe. Sorry, maybe I didn't catch the name entirely right.
Todd. And Max Lebaron is the second.
What they propose as plastics as lands, I think is very recognizable. And of course, you mentioned indigenous trajectories. I referenced the constructivist inheritance and the kind of surprising recognition within an industrially shaped Soviet revolution of the idea that objects can be comrades too. Of course, you are entirely right that in trajectories of indigenous socialism that has always been the case. In a way, if we're looking for not necessarily to the deep past, as in the case of the Ediacaran era that I was discussing, but in a relatively recent past, non-proprietary relationships to the world, although depending on which, there's no generic indigeneity, and we also have to be careful not to romanticize by suggesting that somehow de-indigenous as an abstract category represents by definition non-proprietary relationships to the world, because that's not the case. But if we think of the way that Nick Estes of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe writes about it, for example, in Our History is the Future, I think that is exactly the type of trajectory, non-proprietary trajectories of indigenous socialist practice that we will be talking about, and that prefigure how we face the challenge to live with fossils as skin and plastics as land, how to insource rather than outsource our toxic comrades.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have one final question by Chico Arthur and Judah.
Hi. Yeah. Oh, great. Thanks a lot, Jonas, for this terrific lecture. I think first, I particularly appreciate your points about, I think the way you put it is Earth memorialization of histories of predation, but not memorializing histories of non-predation kinds of relationships. And I thought that that perhaps is a very powerful point around which one can begin re-envisioning the future. But my question is actually based on something you said earlier in your presentation about collectivities. And my sense is that the politics of collectivity you talked about, for example, in relation to Facebook and other trillion-dollar companies, that relationship is sort of based, that idea of collectivity is based on the politics of payment or paying back, which I wasn't surprised given the very Marxist orientation of your talk. But then I thought that there's something to think about in that vocabulary of payment, or a rather monetary vision of redress and reform, and the extent to which that actually helps us realize the kinds of politics that you talked about in the sense of the non-predation non-violent kinds of society of the future that you want us to begin to imagine. So I'm wondering the extent to which that payment, in a monetary version, kind of it, the idea of reading us as ecosystem workers, and not a different vision of how to live in a society outside of those capitalist terms of engagement.
Yeah, thank you. That's such an excellent question and a really sharp observation. You're of course completely right that the Collectivize Facebook campaign runs on, in a way, a very kind of first base slogan, which is you worked for it, you own it. And it's about trying to, it's an attempt to try to find the quickest pathway to make people conscious of the fact that they are data workers. That companies like Facebook or Amazon or Apple or Monsanto, they are not providing a service to us. We are providing a service to them. And when we agree in the conditions of terms and conditions, when we register in Facebook, we have essentially signed a working contract for non-payment, a working contract in which we ourselves have become the product of extraction also of our data, our behaviors that contribute to the building of consumer profiles, to micro-target other consumers, and to build the kind of predictive markets that I was discussing with Lisbeth earlier on. But obviously this is not, the goal is goes much further. What we want is to file this lawsuit and build towards alternative forms of collective ownership that go beyond the corporation and that go beyond the state, that are about trying to stretch the idea of the cooperative, of the commons, from hyper locality to large-scale infrastructures like that of the trillion-dollar companies, and in which the question of being paid is much less important than the imaginary of common ownership. And of course, the paradox of common ownership is that then we don't really have to talk about ownership. Like when there is a commons, the idea of ownership disappears entirely. Like the term is no longer relevant. And I think it's also about the madness, of course, of the trillion-dollar company and of this really deeply rooted idea of the right to property, and also how property relates to success and validation. This is how all of these companies profile themselves. Like, okay, like Facebook or Amazon, yes, the mad CEOs, but they take risks and they break things, but they never did. Like Facebook wouldn't exist without the data work of millions. Like we provide that labor. What is Google? What is Google other than the work of other people? Like what is the Google search machine other than a reference to the work other people do without being paid by Google? Stronger, we pay Google to be visible in their search machine. Apple products, so-called innovation, all developed through publicly funded research. Monsanto capitalizes on decades, if not centuries, of seed knowledges of indigenous people and farmers. So the thing is that they never owned themselves. They were always ours. Like we always made them. They wouldn't exist otherwise. And I think that's for me the core for Jan Verman and me through this lawsuit against Facebook, hopefully against other trillion-dollar companies as well, to in a way show the commons within our condition of capitalist capture. That the idea of ownership, it's not about how do you call it? When we collectivize Facebook, it will not be the first time that it was collective. We already did that collective work in the first place for it to come into being in the first place. They never had the right to own it. It was always ours. I think that is the underlying reality we try to make visible, rather than, as you say, and which indeed can be very easily misinterpreted in the sentence, you worked for it, you pay it, as if we want to continue to exacerbate this system of proprietarization, and that the only thing that we're saying is simply well, actually, we're going to keep the system intact. It's just that now you will get money for your data work. That's not the point. The point really is and should be to show the world in common within capitalist enclosure. Thanks for the question.
Is there another question, Sabrina? Jonas, thank you very much for this fantastic lecture. Thank you everyone for asking such wonderful questions. And I wish we had more time because the chrono-political struggle, as a phrase that you came up with and that I love, demands far more thinking and discussion, I think. Thank you very much, Jonas, for joining us.
Thanks a lot. Thanks everyone for listening.